Welcome everyone, Questine here with the discussion about Cavalry in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires and the best Cavalry races currently in the game. Now, Cavalry in Warhammer 3 is obviously going to be of limited value, because in sieges they are not really that great. So Cavalry can be great obviously in all the open field battles. We're going to have mainly really the minor settlement battles we're going to be dealing with at the moment until the AI does build some garrison buildings. But certainly Cavalry is limited in any actual settlement battle, be it an unwalled settlement or a walled settlement, especially with the walled settlements, because breaking down the walls costs ammunition. Even if you have a decent amount of artillery, you're not going to have enough wall breaches to really utilize the cavalry properly, unless you're one particular race which has the ability of breaking down the walls beyond artillery. But that's a discussion for later in the video. So we start with the Empire. I know many people were annoyed by their lack of inclusion when it came to the artillery list, but from my perspective, anything the Empire can do, Cathay can do better. They have better economy, better growth, better pretty much everything, despite the annoyances of the harmony system and all the issues that you do encounter in Cathay and campaign. When it comes down to it, really, with artillery, it's like the Empire is just in a really poor state, because it takes until tier 4 to get any decent artillery option. And at the end of the day, your campaign is going to be decided long before that in any campaign you're playing. With the exception of course, Marcus Wolfhard, who can get artillery, but that's a very specific campaign with a specific system. By and large, the Empire struggles until tier 4. Unless you abuse Imperial authority and capture Null much earlier on in your campaign, but still, significant limitations when it comes to that, and the Empire is just in a poor state. Cavalry-wise, however, the Empire does have some advantages. In fact, I would say their cavalry line is probably the strongest that they have. I know people like to talk about the benefits of the volley guns, the steam tanks, and all that, but to me, those are not really practical units because it takes so long to get them. And really, steam tanks, at their expense, not necessarily worth actually using in an army. I mean, a couple maybe to be as tanky units for your range line, but yeah, plenty of issues. But let's look at their cavalry line when it comes down to it. And I'm going to do this through the unit browser. So, cavalry-wise, at tier 2, we get Imperial Knights, and we also get Pistoliers. Now, Imperial Knights, pretty decent cavalry units, good amount of armor, good stats, very solid unit when it comes down to it. Then, of course, you get Pistoliers as well, who are short-ranged for a range unit, but they can fire while moving. They do have some limitations because they're a gunpowder unit, but because of their higher elevation they're shooting from, they don't have the same issue that infantry gunpowder units do have. Then at tier 3, you get the Knights of the Blazing Sun, the Outriders, and the Outriders with grenade launchers. Now, to talk about these units, the Knights of the Blazing Sun obviously can be pretty expensive unless you get their chapter house, which is in Talabecland. The Outriders are pretty good skirmisher units, gunpowder units of course, but still higher elevation, pretty good, solid range. Obviously they're not great to use compared to crossbowmen and archers, because obviously gunpowders won't be able to shoot in a siege over the walls the way archers and crossbowmen can, and huntsmen later on, but still fairly effective unit in open field battles. And skirmisher cavalry units can be great because one of the things you can do in a lot of battles is, let's assume you're attacking an army, but you don't want to attack them in the open because they might overwhelm you. That generally happens on higher difficulty where the AI just has so many more troops than you. So you want to put your troops in a favorable position, corner camping, or just good terrain. Well, with skirmisher cav, you can attack a part of the enemy army and draw it to you. That's the great thing. You can really gain a lot of benefits from these guys. And then of course we have Outriders with grenade launchers. Shorter range, but still pretty solid in their own right. Can't attack air, though. That's fine. You have plenty of options of attacking air with ranged. Good amount of damage, though, when it comes down to it. Having grenades as a tier 3 cavalry unit, pretty damn solid in a lot of ways. You also have the war wagons with mortars, if you want to count those as cavalry, available. Of course, when it comes to tier 3, we can't forget the Rice Guard, which are in their own right a fairly solid cavalry unit, just basically better Imperial Knights in every single way that matters. But is it worth building their dedicated structure to get just a somewhat better version, more expensive version than Imperial Knights? I don't really believe it is. So these guys aren't really practical. They're not bad in any way. They do have quite a few benefits, of course, but still, it's just not worth getting the structure for them. And if you're playing Marcus Wolfhard, generally speaking, in his campaign, you're either going to want to get Great Swords and Huntsmen, or you are going to want to get those Hellstorms quickly, because he's the only one who can actually benefit from the artillery power in an Imperial campaign when it actually matters. And then, of course, at tier 4, we do have Demigryph Knights and Demigryph Knights with Halberds. The regular Demigryph Knights with their anti-infantry role, pretty solid, really solid causes fear. And then, of course, the Demigryph Knights with Halberds. The way to view the Halberd situation, I mean, it's not going to be great in a lot of ways when it comes down to it with those Halberds. Like, yes, they do get the bonus versus large. The way to view Demigryphs is they're not a unit for charging against infantry. They're an anti-cav unit during the course of your campaign. I would say probably the regular Demigryph Knights are worth it. And of course you get regiments of renown like the Royal Altdorf Griphites, which cause terror, armor piercing, just really a better version than these guys, especially when we're looking at like melee attack, melee defense, all that kind of stuff. So overall, a fairly solid roster, certainly from my perspective, the strongest part of the Imperial roster at the moment, because they can get some pretty good solid cavalry choices early, and that is important. It doesn't matter how good a unit is if it's behind, you know, a tier 4 or tier 5 wall. That's the issue with Hellstorms. But having Imperial Knights or Knights of the Blazing Sun or even Rice Guard available at tier 3, with of course regular Imperial Knights and Pistoliers at tier 2, does give you certain advantages during the course of your campaign. I would certainly like to use the Knights of the Blazing Sun far more though in a campaign, but still, some fairly solid choices all around for the Empire when it comes down to it. At number 4, we of course have the Vampire Counts. When you think of the Vampire Counts, you don't necessarily think about their cavalry choices, but they do have pretty good cavalry choices, and ones they can maintain relatively cheaply, at least with the Blood Dragon, when we're talking about the particular cavalry choice. Though it is a skill choice that you're going to have to make with the Blood Dragon, of either upkeep for Blood Dragons or upkeep for Graveguard. Graveguard might be the better choice though from a practical standpoint, because hey, maintaining a full stack of Graveguard can be pretty damn expensive during the course of a campaign. But still, let's look at the Vampire Count roster. Now, one of the things to really mention over here is that the tier levels for units don't matter for the Vampire Counts. Fight a massive battle on the campaign map and you can get Blood Knights from, like, I don't know, the first 10 turns of your campaign. Depends on the kind of battles you're fighting, how often you're fighting them. But tier limitations when it comes to recruitment don't really apply to the vampires. That's the first thing to mention. So their cavalry is very practical. The only thing you're obviously going to be concerned about is cost, because these units can be pretty expensive. But then again, there's also some cheap units available pretty early on. So at tier 2, you're going to get the Black Knights. Pretty solid unit, though obviously not necessarily as good as the Imperial Knights, but still bonus versus infantry, magical attacks, decent amount of armor. I'd say Imperial Knights are better when it comes to a cavalry duel, but when it comes to just dealing with an infantry blob in terms of flanking attacks, yeah, Black Knights are great. And then you look at tier 4, you get the Black Knights with lances and barding. These guys are quite a bit more substantial. Though obviously, because of the lances, they're losing that bonuses versus infantry choice benefit. Then, of course, you have Hexwraiths. These guys, obviously 0 armor, but 55% physical resistance. Strider. So no penalties over terrain. Pretty damn important when it comes to cavalry vanguard deployment. Just a lot of power when it comes down to this particular unit over here. Lots of benefits. So it's ethereal. It does have all that physical resistance, and other cavalry may not necessarily be able to deal with them very, very easily. And then, of course, at tier 5, you do get Blood Knights. Now, as I mentioned, you can get a lot of these units, or all of these units, from the Raised Dead mechanic. The only unit I haven't actually seen in the campaign so far is just, yeah, the Terrorgeist. Everything else I have seen in Raised Dead piles, Blood Knights. Obviously in limited numbers, but this unit can be expensive. You do have a good economy, but still affording a lot of these guys. But you can reduce their upkeep by 50% using a Blood Dragon. Remember that. So you can actually afford a lot of these guys in certain armies if you get those Blood Dragon or dragons, or if you get the Red Duke who has both the upkeep for Blood Dragons and the upkeep for Graveguard. So pretty powerful unit. Bronze Shield. Good, decent level of armor. Not necessarily the highest, but still bonus versus large. So the bonus versus large is an anti-cav bonus. And when cav to cav bonuses, these guys would do pretty well. They do get frenzy. They do get hunger. So these guys are pretty damn substantial when it comes to their battle prowess. Not necessarily just based on the stats here, but also the effects that they have. Really good unit, really solid, and it is practical. It is available pretty early. It can be available pretty early on in your campaign. Hell, you might even start with them. And I gotta say, these guys can carry a fight on their own. I mean, the vampire counts are certainly a race heavily based on doing well with their heroes and lords, but some of their cavalry options are really great in a stand-up fight in their own terms. So that's a vampire counts. Pretty solid race. Has a lot going for it from a cavalry department. The only downside, I would say, that exists for the vampire counts is they have no siege ability in settlements. Now, they have enough power to force open the gates, but without the ability of breaking down walls, obviously the cavalry is going to be far more limited when it comes to siege battles. So if you're playing the vampire counts, a couple of units, maybe 2-3 units of cavalry per army won't go amiss, but more than that is just kind of pointless to have. You want the flying units, you want the infantry, you want to have the ability of just smashing through a gate full force. And while cavalry just isn't going to be suited for that fight, it doesn't matter how good they are. Throw a unit of halberdiers, they'll do a significant damage to any cavalry unit that you have, including Blood Knights. So just be aware of that particular situation and the limitation that the vampire counts do have. But in open field battles, absolutely very strong when it comes down to them. At number 3, we have Kislev, and I gotta say this is one of those few instances where I actually do agree with the results of the poll as people voted on it. So Kislev, you might think it's a range race, but yes, their Kossars are pretty effective early on, but they do get outclassed pretty quickly. Ice Guard are not that great. Melee race, yeah, Tsar Guard are decent, but that's just it, they're decent. The real power of Kislev is in their cavalry. And when it comes to cavalry, you can be damn certain that I'm counting the sleds as part of cavalry. In fact, these guys are absurdly strong when it comes to Kislev roster. Of course, Kislev does have some issues when it comes to being able to get access to these units, or do they? Therein lies the question, because they can get access to a lot of these units far quicker, obviously through the Kislevite cities. Like, for instance, it isn't necessarily that hard to get access to some of these units, though generally you are going to be limited by a tier 4 wall unless you're talking about certain structures in the Kislev cities. By the way, let's take a look at that situation, what they have beyond the limitations when it comes to tier levels. Just bear in mind though, Kislev does have good growth. Of all the problems they have in their campaigns, they have good growth, especially if you're playing as Boris Ursus. You have great growth faction wide. So remember that, like, limitations of tier only apply when growth isn't significant enough to overcome it. Kislev doesn't have that problem. They may have it for their special cities, but even then, not really, because they have 2 structures that start at 30 growth each. So Kislev may not have a commandment that gives them growth, but obviously they have the atamans that can give them growth. It can be a bit of a hit or miss situation. Bear that in mind. Now, when we're looking at Kislev's cavalry roster, the basic choice is the wing lancers. Like, I'm not even going to pretend the dervishes or the horse archers are worth a damn. Horse archers, yes, they can be useful to harass the enemy, but they're just too vulnerable, too weak armor. The problem with cavalry archers is that, given their low armor, they're just going to get annihilated by any ranged unit that they come in contact with. That's the difference between these guys and outriders. Like, outriders are damn useful. These guys, These 2 units, not worth them. In fact, this entire building chain is not worth it. Because there's other ways of getting access to Winged Lancers, by the way, in a campaign, Prague in particular. By the way, you can look at the Winged Lancers. Pretty good stats, pretty good armor, but they're really a charge cavalry. They're not the cavalry that's going to stand up in a straight fight. They don't have the melee defense or melee attack to do so. They can do a decent amount of damage, but really the damage they're doing is going to come from the charge bonus that you have. So really a powerful unit when it comes to charging. Not so powerful when it comes to standing up in a fight. So severely limited from that perspective. Then at tier 3 you also get the Snow Leopard, which I would count as a cavalry unit because it's not the unit you send in a siege for the walls. If you do that, you're just committing suicide with this particular unit. But it has an extraordinary high level of damage. It's anti-large, it's armor piercing, it's got frostbite. This thing is a unit killer, a hero killer, a lord killer. This thing is ridiculous. In fact, some people have really made Kislev campaigns work by just getting a lot of these guys in their campaigns. Like, really fast, high level of speed, really high level of damage. When you see these things rip certain units to shreds, it is incredible. Can't resist a lot of damage, but can do a significant amount of damage. The perfect glass cannon unit in a lot of ways. And of course at tier 3 you also get the light war sleds. And it's really when we start talking about the war sleds that things start getting really interesting for Kislev. So light war sleds, they can do a decent amount of damage from range, and they have an elevated platform to shoot their guns. So basically these guys are carrying a number of Streltsy on them. So they can do a fair amount of damage from range, but it's not the range that makes these war sleds great. It's their melee benefits. Not necessarily the best armor, but pretty decent melee stats in a lot of ways. A decent amount of HP. Not the greatest in the world, absolutely, but it's an amazing harassing unit. And it can stand up in a fight because it's pulled by Kislev polar bears, which are pretty damn crazy. And this is the weaker version of these guys. At tier 4, of course, we get into heavy war sleds. These guys are monstrous. These guys are absolutely insane as a unit. Not necessarily the best melee attack, melee defense, again, but the sheer amount of damage these guys can do, their high leadership, high armor makes these guys a great unit to throw against the enemy. Pretty high level of weapon strength over there. And of course, we do get that bonus versus infantry and armor piercing when it comes to that. Then you have the Griffin Legion. Higher level, basically Winged Lancers just upgraded. Still basically charge cavalry, but much higher level of armor. Still not necessarily the best melee stats to take a fight, but pretty effective. We'll get the job done. We'll do a decent job. We'll be able to survive a more prolonged melee fight. Just an upgraded version of the regular Winged Lancers. In fact, I don't really see the point of getting Winged Lancers, considering if you take Prague, you can get Griffin Legion far easier. I guess the cost could be a factor in it. Kislev doesn't have necessarily the best economy, but still. And finally, of course, the star of the show, the one unit that actually gets Kislev on this list, because everything I've mentioned so far, it's decent, but it's not great. But what's great, the Warbear Riders. Now, these guys are actually good in sieges. You take these guys, you smash down the gates, you throw them in. You can do the same with the sleds, but obviously some problems. These guys have a much higher melee attack, pretty good armor, a significant benefit in armor piercing, a benefit versus large, and they cause fear. They're absurd. These guys are your stand-up melee cav. Again, I'm not necessarily too pleased about their melee defense, but when you see these guys in action against melee units, like, you don't cycle charge with these guys. You charge once, you keep them in the fight, and they'll survive and win through. Pretty good armor, pretty good stats, will get the job done very effectively. Warbear Riders are great. And because there's so few of them, they are actually going to work very, very well in a siege as the frontline unit that you charge through the gate. This is the first unit that should go through the gate, in point of fact, if you're playing as Kislev, followed up quite likely by the Tsar Guard, and then by the sleds and other things as well. And then you gotta remember that your heroes, your lords and heroes, are also going to be riding these war bears, and they're going to do very, very well doing so. So pretty effective in battle in a prolonged melee engagement. So Kislev has glass cannons. It has units that can do skirmishing. It has the ability of it has cavalry units that have the ability to stay in a prolonged fight. Really good roster when it comes to the cavalry side of things. There are, of course, problems in the Kislev roster. One of the issues is, of course, the lack of artillery until tier 4, which complicates your situation in sieges. And, of course, Warbear Riders themselves are also tier 4 unit. It does work. It does work pretty well, but basically you have to deal with the entire early game as Kislev without any of those wonderful units, unfortunately. And you're just going to be spamming Kossars and armored Kossars. And it works. It can even be considered practical for a longer-term campaign, but short-term, not going to work that well. Not until you get the growth sorted out. That's not necessarily going to take a huge amount of time, though, as Kislev, given the high levels of growth they can get. And number 2, we have the Warriors of Chaos, and I would say the term to use for them is versatility, because they have a lot of choices to be made that do fill different purposes. That's one of the strengths they have in their campaigns. Like, there's a lot of unit types over here, and all of them are pretty damn solid. You, of course, get chariots, which can be pretty effective, heavily armored, different effects. But let's focus a bit on, like, you do get skirmisher cav, though short ranged, unfortunately, either with throwing axes or with javelins. Can be great at luring the enemy to attack your positions. Marauder Horsemasters, pretty decent, of course. Decent enough range, decent enough armor for that particular purpose. Then, of course, we gotta look at the Chaos Knights, the regular Chaos Knights, and then, of course, the ones with lances and the variants. By default, Chaos Knights are pretty damn good. As a Warriors of Chaos, you may not necessarily care too much about cavalry because your infantry line, well, good luck trying to charge the Chaos Knights infantry line. So cavalry is a bit redundant in quite a few ways for the Warriors of Chaos. I mean, it works, and you do have the Shatterstone ability as Chaos, because that is important. If you're playing Chaos Undivided or any Warriors of Chaos, you can get access to Hell Cannons. If you're Undivided, you start with the Hell Cannon, so that's a really good artillery unit when it comes to breaking down the walls. Then you have Shatterstone, so you can make huge gaps in a wall in sieges, making your ability to actually use cavalry that much better. But looking at the situation, great chariot choices. You do get regular Chaos Knights, pretty good armor, really good stats across the board when it comes to these guys. Then you get the ones with lances, much better charge bonus when it comes down to these guys versus the regular ones. So pretty effective, both these choices. Though obviously the regular ones are just going to be better in a prolonged fight. The ones with the lances are better at cycle charging. Then you have to look at the variants. So Chaos Knights of Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh. In particular, the Slaaneshi ones are insane when it comes to cycle charging, rather the ones with Lancers, because they get devastating flankers. So entities with the attribute double their charge bonus when attacking the rear or flank of an enemy entity, which obviously cavalry is going to aim to do in every situation. This means they're doing a ridiculous level of charge damage, 120 if you're getting that off. Pretty damn powerful ability when it comes at. Also really fast as well, really damn fast, because of course they're fast. They're Slaaneshi, so they get 5 extra speed when it comes down to it. Overall, really good stats across the board. A bit softer, if you will, but still pretty damn great. Or you can go with the Siege variant for the barrier. The Khorne variant basically gives you better ability to stand in a fight, or even some charging benefits with Frenzy over there, assuming your leadership is pretty high. Regardless of which version you're going here with the Chaos Knights, I'd say the only one that's kind of weak is obviously Nurgle. They're better in a straight up in a prolonged engagement, at least from a survival perspective. They do get those poison attacks, but all of these choices are pretty good in their own right. Then, of course, you get the Doom Knights of Siege, Flying Cavalry. Flying Cavalry is pretty damn important. Good stats, silver shields, magical attacks, just an amazingly powerful unit with Vanguard deployment. And then you get to even higher level, then you talk even about the star of the show, and probably the best ground-based cavalry unit in the entire game, or certainly one of the best. We get the Skull Crushers of Khorne. Frenzy, spell resistance, fear, bonus versatile, so good against other cavalry, high levels of armor, very good level of armor, piercing. I'm not entirely certain, but I think these guys can take out pretty much any other cavalry unit in a straight up fight. Though that's not really the metric I would necessarily use when it comes to cavalry in terms of their usefulness. Certainly not in campaigns. Multiplayer, a different discussion, but when we're talking about cavalry in campaigns, you don't want to fight enemy cavalry with your cavalry most of the time. You want to have your halberdiers fight the enemy cavalry because they are stupid enough to actually charge them in, while your cavalry runs around their entire line, smashing their artillery and range units. That's how you want things to go down, and they can often do so. You do get the Hellstriders of Slaanesh as well, unless you're a dedicated faction. But you do have some really, really good choices over here. And then, of course, we could talk about the demonic units as well, which could be considered cavalry. So some fairly solid choices in the cast roster. Their regular knights are really good. Their horse masters, their marauders in general are fairly solid for their role, though a bit too weak armor on the regular ones. Still, horse masters get the job done as harassing cavalry, skirmisher cavalry. The chariots get the job done. And the Chaos Knights are pretty crazy when you face them in battle. So overall, Chaos has a great deal of choices, and the abilities that they have in their faction to break down walls of fortresses using Shadowstone actually makes cavalry that much more useful in a siege. There's only so many siege pieces you can bring, right? And it's going to take them time to break down those walls. Well, with Shadowstone, you don't have to worry about that. So you get a lot more flexibility in battles, and that does help when it comes to using cavalry. Am I the kind of person who uses cavalry as the Warriors of Chaos? Not really, but the vast majority of times the battles that give me troubles in a campaign are siege battles in particular, because every other battle I can pretty much auto-resolve in a Warriors of Chaos campaign. So I'm not really struggling here when it comes to field battles. And finally, at number 1, is of course Bretonnia. Bretonnia is ridiculous when it comes to their cavalry for more than just one reason. First off, they have a good economy. Their baseline economic structure generates 300 income. That is actually one of the highest in the game. I think only the Warriors of Chaos actually get more from the baseline economic structure, and of course that's only in Dark Fortresses. It is a bit annoying that you require windmills and water wheels to be able to upgrade the farms, but once you do start upgrading them, you do get up to 900 income. 600 by default with the water wheel 50%, so that is 900 income that you're going to generate from the base economic structure. Of course, you're limited by the peasant economy, but that's really only an issue in the early game. Bretonnia is a bit limited in the early game, but they do have the ability of getting ridiculously powerful a bit later on, for a number of reasons beyond just the economic potential. They have one of the highest growths in the entire game. Plus 20 at level 1, plus 40 at level 2, plus 60 at tier 3. That is ridiculous. We're talking greenskin level of growth, going all the way up to plus 100 growth. It gets absurd when you start talking about Bretonnian growth. On top of that, they actually do gain a significant amount of money in terms of post-battle loot. Yes, it costs you chivalry, but chivalry is going to be plentiful during the course of a campaign. And sacking settlements nets you a significant amount of income by default, and you can get a quote-unquote negative trait that gives you plus 50% benefit to sacking settlements. So it gets a bit absurd when it comes to their economic potential and their growth potential. They are limited by peasants, but that only lasts until you get the water pumps, and of course, the unification of Bretonnia. You can get quite a lot of peasant slots as Bretonnia. On top of that, and it gets even better, but on top of that, their cavalry choices are fantastic. They do have siege at tier 2, which helps them break down walls, which is actually important for cavalry to be useful in sieges. At tier 1, they get mounted yeomen and yeoman archers. The archers are decent enough. They're not the best range units, they're not the best skirmisher units, but they are going to be decently useful at distracting the enemy and luring them into your prepared artillery positions. At tier 2, they get Knights Errant. Imperial Knights are better, yes, flat out just better than these guys, but still they're a pretty decent option. And they're quite cheap as well, if you get the vow. Though bear in mind, the upkeep that's being shown here is not the upkeep that you would pay for if you don't have the vows or the frauds. It would actually be higher, but still a pretty decent cheap option. At tier 3, you get Questing Knights and Knights of the Realm. The way to view these two units is Knights of Realm are a charge cavalry unit, so less useful in sieges, but better on the battlefield when it comes to dealing with enemy cavalry. But it's really Questing Knights that take the cake. Really good stats, decent armor piercing, really good unit. At tier 4, we get Grail Knights. These guys are basically Knights of the Realm, just upgraded. Magical attacks, bonus versus large, shielded units. Overall, a good unit with perfect give vigor and a good amount of physical resistance. At tier 5, we of course get flying units, more flying units. We already start getting Pegasus Knights at tier 4, and in tier 5 we'll get Royal Pegasus Knights and Royal Hippogriff Knights. But it's really the Grail Guardians that win out as the ground-based cavalry that Bretonnia has. Lots of armor, good stats. This is the kind of unit like Warbear Riders you smash through an open gate and watch them kill everything in sight. If you even want to do that as Bretonnia, let me explain. So, as Bretonnia, you could use your ground-based cavalry, but you can also use your flying-based cavalry to just fly over the walls. Oh, you want to win a siege battle? No problem. Get Pegasus Knights, or really Royal Pegasus Knights and Hippogriff Knights. Yes, they are expensive, but you'll certainly have the money for these guys, and you'll be able to get them relatively quickly in your campaign because of the excellent growth that Bretonnia does enjoy. Royal Hippogriff Knights, because there's a few of them, they have great stats. You throw these guys over the walls of a settlement, you watch them go win the battle on their own, just doing significant damage to units. That ability for cavalry to just fly over the walls makes them great in sieges, and they're pretty damn good on an open field battlefield. Of course, they cause terror, they have the Blessing of the Lady, they have Siege Attacker, funnily enough. So you don't even need trebuchets with these guys, though of course trebuchets can still be very, very useful. So Bretonnia, really good cavalry really good cavalry faction. If they didn't have the flying units, they wouldn't be so high up on this list, but the flying units give them so much versatility in battle, and the cavalry units are practical. You can afford them if you get the vows. The annoying thing is really getting the vows, because the cost of these units is too damn high if you don't have them. But still, you get the vows, you get a ridiculously powerful cavalry force that is versatile. You have different units for different purposes. You have anti-infantry cav, you have anti-cav cavalry available to you as well. You have charging cavalry, you have anti-infantry cavalry, you have cavalry that can stand up in a melee fight and do a pretty good job. Funnily enough, by the way, just want to mention this, is that the growth that you see in these settlements, they kind of forgot to give that growth to the capital of Bretonnia. So the capital of Bretonnia has slower growth. Don't play Leon Curse campaign. It is actually the worst Bretonian campaign by far. Start position, the limited growth on his capital, the capital of the entirety of Bretonnia. A lot of issues that he has. Like, if you want to play a campaign of Bretonnia, in Bretonnia, play the Fey Enchantress, you're going to be in a much better situation than Lewin in a lot of ways. Of course, you're going to have to deal with Grom the Punch, but you have the tools to succeed against them. And that's it. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.